So I know that some more people are going to be joining, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started at least with introductions. So again, I welcome you to Bethel Synagogue, to our virtual home for now. And this is a special week in the Jewish calendar because this week we're heading towards the holiday of Tu B'Shvat, which is a holiday not mentioned in the Bible, but appears about 2,000 years ago in a text called the Mishnah, where it's really almost described as a Jewish Arbor Day, a day to plant trees, but really to take an accounting of the trees in our fields and actually an accounting literally to pay a tax over them. Over the course of the centuries, of course, this day gets expanded and the meaning gets expanded and changed as a day. Really, I guess you could almost think of it as the Jewish Earth Day. And in mystical kind of medieval times with cosmic significance. And today, of course, we really focus much of our attention on our responsibility to the environment. And so at Bethel Synagogue in St. Louis Park, we're initiating this week of learning tonight, and there'll be events throughout the week. Tomorrow night with Cantor Abrams singing songs about trees and about nature. Then on Wednesday night, we have a celebrity chef and a mixologist that'll use the products of trees and of the earth to delight our senses. On I think it's on Thursday, I'm teaching a meditation, kind of eating meditation session, and then there's also a session on Jewish law around the environment and climate justice. So I hope that you'll join Bethel for some of those. And outside of Bethel, this week begins what's called the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. I'll put a link in the chat where hopefully you can participate. National and international speakers of every variety, and it should be really fantastic. As a way to introduce our speaker tonight, I just want to remind you of the way creation is described in the Torah, the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, where in the beginning God said, let there be light, and there was light. And 10 times actually the Torah repeats, and God said, let there be, and something was. In other words, God spoke the world into being. Through speech, God fashioned. Through communication, God created, according to the Hebrew Bible. Pirkei Avot, teaching from the rabbis from about 1800 years ago, they picked up on this and they asked, well, why did God have to do it that way? Why speak 10 times instead of just one big sentence that says, let there be a world? Now, I'm not sure if their answer is the same as how we would answer, but they answer that it was done in order to give a reward to those who sustain creation and to punish those who destroy creation. In other words, if you sustain creation, it is as if you upheld not just one, but 10 divine utterances. On the other hand, if you destroy creation, the rabbi said, it's as if you undermined 10 and not just one of God's utterances. Again, I'm not so sure about the reward and punishment piece for us, but certainly we can appreciate this central notion that words can create worlds and they can destroy worlds. We see that especially today, of course, with social media, where like this teaching, the impact of our words are magnified many-fold. Well, to help us appreciate this perilous time in which we're living and also the power and potential of our speech to help save our planet, we're delighted to welcome the University of Minnesota's Assistant Professor of Climate Science, Professor Heidi Roop. Professor Roop's professional mission is to improve the reach and impact of climate science in order to engage, motivate, and catalyze action around climate change. She combines climate science and science communication to connect climate change information to decision makers and communities across the Midwest, the United States, and abroad. By producing actionable, relevant climate science, Professor Roop helps diverse stakeholders prepare for this changing climate of ours. She aspires to be a scientist who changes how the world engages in science with scientists. So not someone who's just sitting in an ivory tower, but really doing this such important work that our world demands and this time demands. Professor Roop's climate career has led her around the world, even before Zoom, when she could just Zoom to Washington or Germany. It led her around the world to research in Greenland and Antarctica and the mountains of Vietnam and New Zealand. She's a lead scientist for the science communication at the University of Washington's Climate Impact Group, and she's worked as a physical scientist at the United States Geological Survey's Colorado Water Science Center. She's also used her science communication expertise to help organizations like NASA and the National Science Foundation to more effectively communicate their work, and she also serves as the editor of the journal Geoscience Communication. We are so delighted and privileged to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Alexander, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We're going to go on a whirlwind tour that's going to take us from outer space to our own neighborhoods, and I really love that words can create worlds, and that's really how I'll bookend our conversation today, which is, I'll steal my own thunder here, and just say that I hope that this will empower you to use your words and your concerns and connections about your community and our climate to have conversations and to build dialogue. And I think really through conversation and through community, we can really confront the challenge of climate change. So I will share my slides with you, and I guess I'll just say buckle in. We're gonna do the best we can with it going global and bringing it local, and then hopefully some time for some questions and some dialogue of our own. So thank you again for taking this time and for the opportunity to share some of my perspectives with you this evening. So you had a sort of maybe a long introduction to me, but I guess we'll summarize it to say that I'm an earth scientist with a passion for communication. And I've really, in my own career, gone in this arc from data to dialogue, in that I started with the nitty gritty, getting my hands dirty, collecting sediment cores and ice cores from some of our world's remote places and continents, and have taken that passion for understanding Earth's climate and brought it into how is it that we actually address these changes that scientists have very clearly laid out for us in terms of not only how different today is from our geologic past, and I'll show you a bit of that evidence today in this talk, but we also have a relatively good handle on what the future holds. And so the question really is, what are we going to do today to shape our tomorrow? And so I'll hopefully provide you with some prompts and some resources that might help you in your own journey and conversations around this challenging topic. Of all the things that I do at the University of Minnesota in my new position, I just wanted to plug the organization that I'm working with closely and building on the foundation of some of my colleagues and peers, most notably Mark Seeley, who might be familiar to some of you. I'm sort of the new Mark Seeley, if you will, which is terrible because there's no such thing as a new Mark Seeley because he's an entity of his own, unto his own. But he and some other faculty and community members started the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership about a decade ago. And the goal in my new position at the university is to really take this partnership, which represents both university, state, local and regional governments, private and public sector staff and organizations, to think about and bring together expertise to help prepare communities around Minnesota and the greater Midwest region for climate change, whether you're target and you're thinking about supply chains, or you're an individual and you're thinking about your own health and well-being or that of your family. So we're building this out, so stay tuned. But I'm sort of bringing some of the knowledge that I'm sharing with you today and this vision from my colleagues that are part of what we call MCAP. Climate change, when I'm asked to talk about this sort of topic, I often find it helpful to zoom out. And this is an image of our lovely planet that we call home, taken by NASA from a satellite in space. And if we really step back and think about climate change, a reason we often don't do a whole lot about it or put it low on the priority list is that it's happening on a scale that is so difficult to comprehend. We often get into our own individual bubbles or those of our communities, and it can sometimes be really hard to hang your hat on the scale of the problem, or we intuitively understand how big of a problem it is, but seeing our individual selves in the solution can be really hard. And so I kind of use this as a reference point for myself to say, you know, it's okay to be overwhelmed by this challenge. But when we think about it, we can zoom in and see that climate is happening on scales that are not so hard to comprehend. We, of course, as a scientific community, we love data, and I promise you there are not that many plots in this presentation. It's too late in the evening for that. But this is all to say that we have very clear evidence that there is change happening on a large scale to our entire planet. This is a graph showing you the change in global mean temperature from the late 1800s to this. I created this plot early last year, so about 2020 of available data. And we're looking at the blue lines, our temperature change over time, and the green line is the concentration of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere. And when we look at this, this is a difference from that dashed line across the middle of the plot is showing you the average global temperature between 1951 and 1980. So you can see that we are on a clear trend towards warmer temperatures, and the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is also going up. And there is a relationship between those two things. More heat trapping gases in our atmosphere results in a warmer planet. And that global warming process translates into a range of climate impacts. And I will tell you what some of those impacts are that we're both observing and projecting for the future here in Minnesota. On the whole, we've warmed the average temperature of the planet by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. So that change is happening on this big scale, that one that's hard to comprehend, but changes are also happening on scales that are not so hard to comprehend, and those are changes in our own backyard. Minnesota's average annual temperature has increased by nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. This is measured from stations in our state. We have some really fabulous long-term records measuring temperature and precipitation back in time. I just talked to the state climate office today to verify this number. It's 2.9 if you want to be precise, but there is some error when we use really long records like this back in time. But this is all to say that the globe is changing and Minnesota is in lockstep. We are changing, and in some cases, you'll see in my next slide, changing more quickly than other parts of the world. We are experiencing a range of climate impacts, so that warmth translates into meaningful and tangible things that come to bear on where we live, where we work, where we play. And the rates of change and the scale at which these impacts are occurring is, of course, widely variable. Turns out the climate system is complicated and complex, just sort of like humans. I often like to describe, people ask about the difference between weather and climate. And I like to think of climate sort of like our mood, our personality. So we sort of all have personalities, but on the day-to-day, there's variability in sort of what side of the bed we wake up on, and we can be moody or happy or sad. And that can oscillate, but how you are in one given day is not necessarily a good predictor of who you are as a whole person. And so in the same way, weather is that day-to-day kind of moodiness of the planet, and climate is its overall personality. And what climate change means is that we're shifting that personality towards one that, in the case of Minnesota, is a bit moodier and swinging more rapidly between emotions of sort of hot and dry and wet. So that's one way that I like to think about this challenge of sort of it's happening at different rates and at different scales. But the point is we're sort of shifting the baseline. We're shifting that baseline personality of our planet. So Minnesota is warming, but we can look at seasonal change, and our winters are warming faster. The middle plot that probably stands out on your eye on this digital screen is the change in winter low temperatures. That is to say that our low temperatures are becoming less common, and we're sort of shifted the baseline of our winter temperatures. Those low winter temperatures are getting warmer and warmer. So the occurrence of, say, those minus 30 days is going to be less and less. So sort of iconically, iconic Minnesota winters. When I work in Antarctica, we often, people ask us, how can you work down there? It must be so cold. And of course, it's sort of cheating because we're down there in the austral summer. So it's the summer months in the Southern Hemisphere when it's winter here. But we often joke that it's far colder in Minnesota than it is in Antarctica on any given day that we're working down there. So Minnesotans are hardy and often grapple with far colder temperatures than even people who do science in Antarctica in the summer. So this is to say our winters are warming, and in fact, our winters are also getting wetter. believe it or not. But this winter, I was just talking today in a disaster preparedness group that we have at the university about how this winter in particular is sort of a good postcard for the future. It's been warm, but interrupted with some spells of pretty significant snowfall. That of course could change, but sort of what we've experienced this winter is kind of iconically what we expect to experience more and more frequently as we march forward in time. So that minimum winter temperature is expected to be around 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by mid-century, so around 2050. So that's our cold winter days are going to become less frequent, less common. We're also, on the flip side, expected to experience around 5 to 15 more days where in the summer, where our maximum temperatures are above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. As someone who's a polar dwelling researcher, this is bad news for me. I don't like hot weather, but those extreme hot days are likely to become more numerous in the future. We haven't actually seen a statistically significant trend or change in these extreme heat days currently, but this is what models project for our future. Our growing season in Minnesota and the greater Midwest region has lengthened by around 15 days. For some, this is a blessing. For others, this is a curse. There are all sorts of feedbacks and pluses and minuses with climate change, those winners and losers. Of course, your growing season length, whether that's a good thing, depends on, say, how much moisture is on the ground or how much snowpack there is, and also sort of how susceptible you are to different types of pests, all of which will be changing and become more complex interactions as our climate system warms and these impacts show up on our landscape. For those of you who garden, the USDA changed planting zones. I think it was around 2015. This is a figure from Climate Central showing the sort of northward migration of our planting zones. So those suitable planting zones are moving in space. And so you can see that as we would you can imagine as we march into the future, you can envision these things marching further and further north, meaning the types of ecosystems and the types of plants and crops that we will be growing, the suitability for those is going to continue to change. You can imagine, however, if you were a tree, if you were planted today, you're going to be mature in decades from now. And so that climate in which you're maturing is going to be very different than the one in which you're planted. And so there are people actively thinking about how is that we either assist the migration of our forests northward or bring in plants and other species from further south that we know will have a better chance of survival and be able to thrive in these future climate conditions where it will be warmer and wetter. So we see across eastern states, including Minnesota, it got bundled into the eastern states bucket for this particular analysis by the Forest Service and the USDA, is that we are seeing tree species migrating. So that the range, not only is it the sort of the range of things like fruits and vegetables that we would be growing in our backyards, but we're actually seeing sort of forest composition change and tree type change, and they're slowly, as you can imagine. The tree can't move itself, but its seeds can move. We're seeing this migration. So we're seeing these large scale changes occurring in our own backyard. And again, some of them are sort of subtle and we're not able to necessarily perceive these changes. But fortunately, we have lots of scientists out there monitoring and tracking these changes on the landscape. We expect significant changes in our very heavy precipitation. So while we might not expect a change in the total average annual precipitation, sort of how we get our rainfall is already changing and it's projected to worsen. So those heavy rain days and those heavy snow days are projected to become more frequent and more intense. So these events are also, the timing of these events, sort of more water when you don't need it and less when you do, is kind of the water climate story that we have here, as well as in other parts of the country. But these heavy rainfall events are occurring earlier in the growing season. We're now seeing some of our winter precipitation fall as rain, affectionately called slush bombs. We've experienced one of those this already, and we actually have one in the forecast coming up here, I think over the weekend, sort of these warm, wet, sort of snow rain mixes. So these sort of overall patterns of change. Summer rain is projected to increase. You know, this is sort of on and on forever. Things are going to change. I promise you I have a soundbite, a climate soundbite for you at the end of all this. You don't have to remember it all. We see things like changing soil moisture and warming, increasing the risks of disease and pest infestations. This matters not only for ecosystems and crops, but also for human health. So vector-borne illnesses is something that the Department of Health is actively tracking, as well as the CDC, as we create environments and climate that are more friendly to diseases and pests that carry those diseases than we maybe don't have. These are things like an expansion of Lyme's disease and West Nile virus and other things that we maybe aren't even expecting will be increasing to show up that do have impacts for our own health, not just the health of things like crops or of animals and plants. So the soundbite is we're experiencing warmer, wetter conditions overall, and this will continue to worsen in the future. And I would say that the impacts of these are significant and cross all sorts of sectors and communities. So a deep breath, and unsurprisingly, this is the part where I think it gets interesting. I was thinking about the so what. So the climate science can tell us that things are different. Our observations can tell us that things are changing. And we know from the climate system and the relationship between greenhouse gases, these heat trapping gases, and the impacts we see on the landscape that we've committed to change. So I like to say with some of these greenhouse gases, once you emit, you commit. Carbon dioxide can stay in the atmosphere for some cases up to 1,000 years. We, of course, can remove that carbon from the atmosphere using different technologies and planting trees, but there's a lot of it. And for every molecule of CO2 we put up there, we are committing to change. So how we feel climate change kind of builds on these two imperatives. One of them is how quickly and swiftly we act to prevent further warming. So this is further committing to change in the form of our greenhouse gas emissions. This is often referred to as mitigation. You may have heard the state just released its greenhouse gas inventory report last week, showing not so great news as far as our trajectory to meet our clean energy goals and our emission goals for the state. And they're actively working to try to address that shortcoming through a range of policies that are being considered by the governor's new subcabinet on climate change. But basically, we have to prevent further warming, while we also make an intentional investment in preparing for those changes we've set in motion. We know those impacts are coming and we have to prepare. And if we are able to address and balance both of those things in this sort of climate change equation, we can create climate ready, resilient communities, industries, economies, infrastructure. You fill in the lines between what you care about. Achieving that future that we want together in a changing climate requires that we think critically about both of these pieces of this equation, the prevention and the preparation. As we march into so this is probably my last wiggle graph like this. So this one's pretty broad brush strokes here. This is actually just showing you the same plot that I showed you at the top of the talk with our observed change in temperature over time. The black squiggle that you'll see is actually modeled. So that's what the computer models generate. You can see that there's very close agreement between what the models say is happening and what we've observed happening. And then those big red and blue blobs are different trajectories we could go on as far as total temperature change, global temperature change, depending on our emissions. These are referred to as representative concentration pathways. This is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change jargon. The 8.5 means high emissions. 2.6 is low emissions. Many scientists would tell you that that 2.6 pathway is no longer feasible, but it's showing you here, I'm sort of bookending the range of possibilities. And why this matters is that we choose. So the uncertainty in these projections is predominantly not uncertainty in understanding how the climate system works or how it's going to respond. It's uncertainty in what we as a global society will choose to do as far as our emissions. Right now, we are on that red line, that high emissions trajectory. We are marching towards somewhere around 9 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by 2100 as a global average change. Right now, we're sitting at around 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a lot of change and not a lot of years. And we choose whether we bend that curve. So that's the prevention piece. And those are the consequences of inaction and the opportunities of action, whether we choose to bend this particular curve while we simultaneously work to bend a different curve. So I'm going to provide you with some geologic context quickly, in part because this is my, I think this helps sort of personalize my climate change story. I've spent time working in Antarctica, and the reason we go to Antarctica is because there's a lot of ice there. And it turns out that ice contains a very valuable record of Earth's past atmosphere. Between the arms of snowflakes get trapped air that's in our atmosphere when that snow falls. And over time, as that snow gets compressed into ice, the air is actually trapped between those arms of the snowflakes. And we take advantage of the fact that that air is trapped in the ice. So we drill these big cylinders of ice. The middle photograph, this is an ice core and an ice drill from the middle of West Antarctica. We drilled over 3,000 meters of ice, around 10,000 feet of ice, going back around 65,000 years. And from that, we can reconstruct the concentration of Earth's atmosphere for an annual basis back around 30,000 years, and around decadal or 10-year resolution back 65,000 years. And the bubbles in this ice, that snowflake, those tiny little air pockets between the arms of the snowflakes, looks just like this. This is a cross section of an ice core that we collected here and standing in an outlet glacier in East Antarctica. And that air and that sample right there is around 50,000 years old. And what we can do using the same instrument that I would use to measure the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere today, if I went out and took a clean sample of our air, in the same way I can crush this ice and extract the air from those bubbles and measure it on that same instrument and tell you what the atmosphere was 50,000 years ago. And because we have ice cores that go back 800,000 years, we can create these fabulous wiggles that are direct measurements, not proxies or indicators or inferences, right? This is a direct sample of ancient atmosphere back 800,000 years. And ice cores are a primary tool that we have, not only to understand Earth's natural climate cycles. So these are 100,000 year cycles, those big humps you see, these are glacial, interglacial cycles that occur naturally because of Earth's relationship to the sun and how we orbit and move around the sun. This doesn't have today on here, so I'm going to show you. Right now, the axis for the CO2 goes to 320 parts per million. So for the last 800,000 years, we haven't exceeded 300 parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere. When we put on today, you can see that plot, we actually have to change the axis. We're at around 414 parts per million of CO2 today. I just looked up NOAA's center, they measure it every day. And basically the point is today is incredibly different than the geologic past. And this is some of the best evidence we have for the fact that not only is today different and unprecedented, but we can actually use all sorts of isotopes of the carbon, and we can fingerprint where it comes from and very clearly state and see that the CO2 in the atmosphere today is coming from the combustion of fossil fuels. And so it's us. So what do we need to do? We need to rapidly reduce our emissions. In fact, we need to achieve net zero. That means the amount emitted and the amount removed are equal or at zero. And in fact, we actually need to start pulling carbon out of the atmosphere if we want to achieve our global policy targets set in the Paris Climate Agreement, which is to avoid exceeding 1.5 or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit warming of our planet. Remember, we're already at 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit global warming. We're trying not to exceed 2.7. So that's about another degree of warming we have. So this is where the kind of 10 years marching sort of tune has come from, is sort of, we need to do this work today. We need to do it now. There are many paths that can get us there, meaning there are many options for how we can reduce our emissions through the variety of sources, agriculture, transportation, so on and so forth. But the main take home of this squiggly graph from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that no matter the scenario, in order to achieve these targets, we need steep near-term reductions in our emissions. And we need significant removal or negative emissions after 2050. So Another quick side note, maybe not so side note since this is top of mind for all of us, which is that we're currently living through a pandemic. And as a consequence, many of us have changed our behaviors, how we travel, when we see family, how we receive goods to sustain, our lives, and how we get our livelihoods, right? So point being, there's been reductions in CO2 and emissions by around 8%. But to put that in context, that's great. However, we expect that in some sectors, emissions have gone up. In others, they've reduced drastically, in particular transportation, because a lot of us are traveling a lot less. But we expect that to rebound. And to contextualize this in terms of meeting our global targets, we actually need to see emissions fall by around 8% every year this decade if we want to achieve our policy targets. So I say this in part because I think it shows the scale of action. I don't think a pandemic is the way we get there. In fact, it is not. And if anyone tells you that this is the way we get there, it is not. But I think this pandemic can be a benchmark for us in thinking about the scale of action that's needed. And also, I think all of our lives have changed. And of course, the distribution of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have not been equal. The impacts of climate change will most certainly and are most certainly not equal. Those already experiencing inequities and disproportionate impacts of sort of our societal structure are those that are going to continue to feel the negative consequences of a changing climate, as they have with the pandemic. But we need to come up with systems and ways to address this crisis and bend this curve that is, if we turn around, if we're looking at the COVID curve and we look behind us, we can see the climate crisis is calling out for some serious attention. And I, of course, do have hope that with a new era of climate leadership, both at our state and our federal and our international levels, that we'll be marching closer to these targets. All right, so here's the part where we take a deep breath and we look at the good news. And we think about how we get action at the scales that are needed, and importantly in ways that are equitable, or at least factor in the voices who've been left out of the conversation and bring them in conversation so we think about solutions that are not only durable, but lead to lasting change that don't leave people behind. So, a majority of Americans say that climate change is a reality. It's occurring. I don't think a lot of people appreciate this. There's not a lot that we agree on right now. Maybe many of you identify as Americans, I don't know, but generally this is for the United States population. We are in agreement, even across the partisan divide, that climate change is a reality. Of course, it's still a partisan issue, but increasingly we're seeing this as being something that is sort of a cross-aisle challenge, and we're seeking solutions. In Minnesota, we're hovering right around the national average, with 71% of adults saying climate change is happening. And over the last 5 years, recent extreme weather events have had the strongest influence on our views about climate change. That means what people see and what they experience, both at home and through families and their social networks, are changing minds. And I don't find that surprising at all as someone who thinks about human behavior. When we see it, we believe it. And when people that we know are touched by these impacts, they suddenly become far more real than that polar bear on an iceberg. We see, of course, that political leaders and others have influence in this space, but these statistics are sort of changing in time, and the sort of personal lived experiences are really changing people's hearts and minds on this topic. Importantly, and maybe surprisingly, there's a desire for action at all levels of government. This is a poll produced by AP in 2019, and it shows that 83% of Americans want to see the federal government doing more, 80% want to see the state government doing more, and 76% want to see local governments and communities acting on climate change. I'd say that's a significant majority. 50% of those of us in Minnesota want local officials to do more to address climate change. We could obviously bump that number up a bit. And 64% of adults want local citizens to do more to address climate change. And I'd say that I think, that mismatch there is okay. I think as long as we can figure out how to catalyze this local citizen engagement to influence the prioritization of this work at the state level, right? Hold our local leaders accountable. So just as a quick poll, I'll try to put my little screen view here in gallery mode. But do you think climate change will harm you personally? Maybe just raise your hand, maybe you and or your family. Raise your hand if you think that climate change will harm you personally. I see you nodding and hand raising. Does anyone want to unmute and call out the number that you think, how many Minnesotans think climate change will harm them personally? Any ideas? Is someone bold enough to call this out? Any guesses? Less than 50% or more than 50%?
Less.
Less. Okay. 38% of adults think climate change will harm them personally. And here's where we have an opportunity. This is an opportunity where we can use words to change the world, right? And in our own community. We cannot expect people to act differently, to talk differently, to make different decisions, or to engage in their local communities in a way that supports us moving towards climate resilience if people don't see a personal connection to the issue. And this is where you all come in. You must have some interest in the topic if you're here this evening, spending your precious time with us. So I think we need to think critically about how it is that we move this dial. If we can do nothing else, how is it that we can help create personal connections to the impacts of climate change in our own backyard? On the flip side, a whole lot of Minnesotans, 71% in fact, think environmental protection is more important than economic growth. I found that quite surprising. These are from the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication, by the way. They have a wonderful interactive map. It's called the Climate Opinion Polls. They have them for multiple years, and they have the 2020 data set out. This is from 2018. The other statistics are from 2020. And they put out reports called Climate Change in the American Mind, if you're interested in digging into these data a bit further or creating your own maps. And only 36% of adults in Minnesota discuss climate change at least on occasion. This is with family or friends. So again, if we don't have a personal connection and we don't talk about an issue, how can we expect it to be part of our narrative or become something that we put on the list of priorities amongst the sea of other priorities that we navigate every day? So how can you play a role? I stole my old thunder at the top. And I think the one climate action you can do amongst the sea of things that you can do, and we all have different capacities to act, but I think the one thing we can all do is talk about climate change. Have conversations with your families and your friends, with your community, with the folks on this call that are part of your synagogue. Bring climate change into your daily conversations. Build personal narratives around it. And I'll give you a few tips and tricks for how to do this. So I always get this, well, is it as simple as talking about it? And of course, I just gave you a whole spiel for about 25 minutes about all of these changes that are coming and all of the consequences and how big of a challenge it is. And so it isn't so simple, but I do really firmly believe that through creating dialogue, we can create change. But how we talk about it is really important. So there's this work to do to connect this issue that's hard to comprehend, right? This thing that most people think about on the big scale, and thanks to some marketing, we often connect this issue with polar bears, that not something a lot of us have direct experience with or really necessarily care about. I mean, we care about it, but maybe not so much to do something differently in our own lives. There's this real imperative to start connecting these dots between this big phenomenon that is climate change and these hard to comprehend changes and those that are happening in our lives today, or those that will come to bear to have an impact on where we work and live and play. So it isn't as simple as just saying, I care about climate change and here are all the facts, like all the things I just told you. That's not the way to build dialogue. Importantly, contrary to what I just did, it is not all about the science. So when we enter in these conversations, these good faith conversations where we're trying to connect and create these dots, we often start by telling people everything it is we know. And that's not usually how we have effective conversations about other sensitive topics in our lives. So this is more of a reminder for myself, but I see a lot of people do this. They gather all the facts and figures, and then they go tell someone what they should think or how they should think about the issue and why it's so dire. And they leave out the really powerfully potent parts, which are the personal stories. So we have to, and this is kind of academically studied, but there's a real, we need a real shift from sort of this one-way transfer of knowledge, like here are all the things I know that you should know too, and this is why you should care, is that we often are too focused on the content and not focused on the context. So not focused on the person, the situation that they're in, their values, our shared values, the opportunity to have a conversation that isn't just about the facts and figures, it's about the things that we care about. It's about our personal connections and our relationships to one another. And critically, our goal is not to convince people. I can tell you from direct lived experience as someone who gets trolled online, I've been called lots of lovely things, from climate Barbie to, you know, all the hoaxy things you can think of. It's not effective for me to engage in those conversations and try to convince these people of what I believe, right? That's never the goal. It should not be to convince people. And people have actually looked critically at the American population, sort of how we shake out in relationship to this topic of global warming. And we call this the Global Warming Six Americas. Again, this is something done by the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication and George Mason University. And we can kind of divide the American public into these six Americas, ranging from alarmed. These are the people who are sort of like me, saying there's a global scale climate crisis. We have to do something now, right? That's kind of my message. To those people who would be, say, calling me climate Barbie, or a hoax, right? The people who say it's not real, it's this conspiracy. So the totally dismissive people. So what's important is if we look at the middle here, the middle of the Americas in this spectrum, less than 1 in 10 people fall into that dismissive group. That is the minority. The thing about the dismissive group is that they tend to be far more strategic communicators and a lot louder voices. So they tend to be perceived as being more numerous than they are in reality because they are effective messengers. 73% of Americans are already engaged and curious about climate change and want to learn more. They represent that middle, the alarmed and the cautious. They want to be engaged in conversation, safe conversation. They want to learn about these changes and not necessarily be convinced, but shown evidence and be in conversation and dialogue around these issues, right? There's a lot of noise out there, a lot of misinformation, and this is where this dialogue and this individual interaction can play a critical role. So I say this in part because I think we tend to shy away from having communication for fear that we're going to end up in these sort of toxic conversations. And I would say that those will be a minority. They might be the ones that have a lasting impact on you personally, but your goal should never be to convince someone in that dismissive group. It just rarely is effective, but instead focusing your attention and your conversations on those of us who are just looking for more information. There's a lot of evidence to show what kind of messaging works, helping people see that it's real, that it's humans, that there's scientific consensus, and that it's bad. Importantly, it's bad for you where you live. And importantly, that there's hope. And these are sort of 5 critical evidence-based messages that work in building these climate conversations. So as I've said, we got to make it personal. We got to make it local. Figure out your why. Why do you care? How will climate change alter the things you care about? Many of you raised your hands to say it would harm you personally. What are those things? What do you stand to lose, but also what do you stand to gain from doing something about this challenge? Critically listen from a space of open-mindedness and non-judgment. I think we tend to bring a lot of bias to our conversations, especially when the topics tend to be controversial. And this is just a good thing to always practice in all of our interactions with different people who maybe have different perspectives. Of course, we need to think about how to tell diverse stories from different perspectives, using different tools and mediums, right? We've all gone into this virtual world. We have a whole range of ways that we can communicate and connect with people. We need to think about how to leverage those to include new people in our conversations, to bring in new perspectives, and to think about what those stories are that are relevant and that will resonate. I think through that, we can really achieve this idea of climate resilience. And then, of course, as with any big challenge, it's never done. There's never an end story. Climate will continue to change, will continue to need to adapt, and will continue to be in dialogue with our friends, our peers, our community members. And so with that, you need to reflect, need to ask, and you need to repeat, and you need to bring more people into the conversation. And I think importantly, you know, I gave you a lot of things about how our climate's changing, how it's changing in Minnesota, and what we need to do. And I guess my ask of you this evening is, as you hear of those impacts and you think about your Minnesota, your life, your perspective, how does that fit into just a story that isn't just climate change? What is that personal narrative? Because these are not simply stories of climate change. These are stories about community, about environmental justice, about the need to act, about creating resilience. And we are all part of this story, and you get to help shape this next chapter. It's imperative that we act. It's imperative that we work towards addressing climate change. And one way we can do that is through this dialogue. So the opportunity amongst all of the challenges is that we get to envision our collective future, and we get to work together today to shape that bright tomorrow. And I think as one of the things I'm most excited about this space is that we have to grapple with a lot of change. There are going to be a lot of negative consequences, but how we choose to prepare, how we choose to design and make decisions differently affords us opportunities to come up with solutions that address other problems that are not directly related to climate change, like the inequities in our societies, you know, all of the racism and other issues that we see in our communities and our society. We can, if we are really truly in dialogue and bringing the right people and diverse people to the table, we can think about what that collective future is. We can think about and envision that brighter, more equitable future, and we can work towards that as we design solutions to address this climate crisis that's going to unfold today and will continue to unfold into the future. And so I guess my ask of you is, will you join me in at least one climate conversation outside of this? And it sounds like you have a week full of events that will prompt you with skills and resources and opportunities to both reflect, to ask, to learn, and to repeat. And so with that, I will take some questions.
Thank you so much. That my head is spinning, but in a good way. Appreciate that. I see that Mickey, you had your hand raised.
Yes. My question: you focused primarily, in general, it seemed to me, on air quality. Could you address the impact of climate change on water, with particular focus on the Great Lakes? But I'm also interested in knowing the impact of the climate change that you've described on snowfall and snowfall melt, and how that affects not oceanic, but land-based water levels.
So these are all great questions. So first, the impacts on water. So there are a range of impacts on water. One is the sort of top of mind, of course, as we change our winters, these warmer winters, we are expecting more winters, more winter snow. So a warmer atmosphere holds more water. And so we actually have the potential for more heavy snowfall events. In fact, this year is a great example of that. Well, essentially Duluth and the Twin Cities right now are sitting just above average for our snowpack, slightly above average, which is sort of surprising because the number of snow events that we've had has been far fewer than normal. And that is sort of what we expect with climate change. So our sort of average overall condition isn't expected to change a whole lot, but sort of the type and the amount of precipitation we get in a given event is changing. So these warmer, wetter winters. We're also expecting to see more winter time precipitation fall not as snow, but as rain. And when we look towards the summer months, we're expecting, and we've already seen around a 10% increase in extreme precipitation, but we're expecting more heavy rain events. An example from last year from Southwest Washington, again, another sort of good indicator of climate change and what it will mean for our water resources. In June of last year in Southwest Washington, they had an 8-inch rainfall in one day. That's around a 200-year event. So, and then in July, they experienced a day with 11 inches of rain in one day. That's around a 1,000-year event. Those occurred back to back in 2 months. And the sort of changing of the rolling of the dice of these extreme events, these sort of 500-year, 200-year events, these sort of less frequent but high magnitude events in precipitation, we're expecting to see that occur more and more frequently. We've already observed those changes in the historical record, and we expect that to worsen as we march towards mid and late century. So that's a great question. In terms of lakes and water resources there, we see all sorts of changes in lakes. And of course, there's an interconnection with our own land use and land management practices, but we do see an overall changing in ice in, ice out timing. We're seeing our lake water temperatures warming. We're seeing as a consequence of that, paired with changes in the sort of nutrient load of systems based on nutrients coming into our lake systems, a more occurrence of harmful algal blooms. This is something that's occurring more commonly throughout the Great Lakes. And then of course, we're seeing some things, these storm events can actually result in changes in sort of satiation and how lake levels change and things like that. So I think on the whole, we're seeing these sort of indicators of change today that we expect to continue to worsen into the future as we experience more and more warming.
Thank you.
Looks like Karen has a question.
Hi, I know about this book. It's called Drop Down. It's from 2017. And it's the best list I know of that lists what you can do, what we each can do, and what bigger, I mean, I'm not going to build a wind turbine in my yard, but on the other hand, I might adopt a plant-rich diet or work on my food waste or help with, anyway, the point is, do you know of any more recent list? This was 2017, that's over 3 years old. Right? Is there a more recent list that you could point us to as a resource of what we can do individually to draw down to get carbon out of the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Drawdown is a wonderful resource put together by a former University of Minnesota faculty member and a team at Project Drawdown. I highly encourage you to check out their website. As Karen mentioned, Drawdown does reference primarily actions that happen at a system scale. And this is where it gets really challenging because we have to have action at the scale of systems, meaning we have to act as countries and as international governance, right? To do things at a scale sufficient to manage this crisis, we have to act at levels far bigger than individuals. However, I am not one of the either or mentality. So there are lots of people who dismiss individual action as a meaningful way to make change now because we're sort of so far along this chain and having committed to these impacts. But I think it's both. And I like to say every action matters. So we can all be part of the solution in different ways. And so as Karen mentioned, there are really meaningful things that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is actually supporting and quantifying. One of those is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is really pushing for adoption of a primarily plant-based diet for those of us who live in countries where that's not culturally the case. You don't have to forfeit all meat, but by shifting around 1 or 2 meals. So if all of, just to put this in context, if everyone in the world shifted to a predominantly plant-based diet, it would be equivalent to taking around 2,000 coal-fired power plants off the grid every year, as far as the amount of emissions we would save. It would be around 8 gigatons of carbon per year. That's about electrifying, I don't know how many billions of homes. That's a lot. So small things we do as an individuals collectively can certainly add up. Drawdown is consistently and continues to publish reports. So I encourage you to check out their website. And I actually have a book proposal called Every Action Matters that's hoping to put together some of these individual actions and actually quantify them so you can see what your impact is, because things like driving an electric car, certainly those are great decisions. Those are only available to some of us, of course, to be able to change our mode of transport. But depending on where you live and the source of your electricity, you can get more or less bang for your buck. If you live in Western Washington, where a majority of your power is generated through hydropower, an electric car is great because you're hydropower generated, right? You don't have a carbon footprint. If you are ever in Florida, where a majority of your energy comes from coal, of course, it's still better than a fossil fuel car, but there's still a cost. And it's really hard as an individual to wade through all of that nuance and those data to understand how do you prioritize, right? We all have limited time, we all have limited resources, but we all want to be part of the solution. And so I don't have a good, there's lots of things. There's carbon calculators online. The EPA has one if you want to see the relative sort of impact of different actions. But that's definitely something that I think the science community and the science communication community need to do better, so that it's easier as individuals to engage and make that prioritization.
And when does your book come out?
I don't know yet. It's hopefully it's in acquisitions right now, so I still don't have an official word whether they're going to do it or not. But it would be great to be able to do it. So stand by.
Are you with the press or?
Sasquatch Books. It's an imprint of Penguin Random House. But we'll see. That's a bit cart before the horse. That's a secret. Don't tell anyone. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, so I'm not really telling anybody, but you asked a really great question. So now I'm going to go to my editor and say, look, I just got asked the question. People want this resource.
Oh yeah, no, that's because you know what? Hey, hold on. You wanted people to talk to other people about the climate crisis. I'm telling you, they have other things to talk about. They talk about sports teams, which gladiator won in the football game last night, okay? But if you get them started with their life, then they will talk about, and what kind of plants are you eating? How are you eating this diet? Or so food waste. Yeah, are you doing this compost, or how could we do this better, right? I mean, all these little things, you need support from your friends about how to do this. And you can even get together and do this, right? Mm-hmm. So it will raise the level of scientific dialogue if people do things on an individual level.
Yes. I saw that, Mark, you had your hand up.
Yeah, one of the questions I would ask is, giving a talk like this to those of us who are interested, which is a lot of people, and then I think about legislative actions, especially the state of Minnesota legislative actions, like if you do have occasion to present this information to our state legislators, I'm thinking of the Line 3 tar sands pipeline going through parts of Minnesota from Alberta, Canada to Superior, Wisconsin. First of all, it's taking tar sands, which are challenging to our environment, to say the least, and running it through Minnesota in an area where we have a lot of fresh water resources that can easily get contaminated by the history of this particular company. It seems to me that, working at the state legislative level, and you have probably a good entree to doing that, and convincing these people that this isn't a very good idea going forward with the climate change issues and fuel sources that are bad for the environment and are not being used in Minnesota to start with. I just wonder if you have the opportunity to inform our legislators so they don't make bad decisions to approve something like that Line 3 tar sands pipeline.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. I am providing testimony on Friday, so it's appropriate that you mentioned that. It, however, is not in relationship to Line 3. I haven't had an opportunity to connect directly with Commissioner Bishop. That decision came from MPCA, a lot of the evaluation on the environmental impact assessment. So I haven't followed up with a conversation with her, but I am in conversation with her. She's the chair of the subcabinet for climate change. So there are a whole lot of leaders from tribes and private and public sector that are sitting on that. There are also statewide working groups, interagency working groups with community partners that are trying to address some of these key issues related to both mitigation and adaptation actions that the state will be taking. Governor Walz has made climate change a strategic priority of his administration, and now we have to see where the rubber meets the road. They did put out an assessment most recently of their sub-cabinet actions, and of course this most recent greenhouse gas inventory report points to the fact that we still have a lot more to do. So for me, some of the signs of hope that I see is that, I was just asked by Representative Fu Lee to present. He's the chair of the Capital Investments Committee for the state. So they determine all of the bonding, which is of course a critical mechanism for both incentivizing and requiring action that's related to climate and some of our larger high dollar investments as a state, right? We're assuming a lot of risk if we're paying for infrastructure and other facilities that are not designed to spec for our climate future. And so I'm hoping to engage more with the state, but we'll be providing testimony on Friday to kick off a 3-part special hearings on the role of climate change and climate action within our capital investments decision making. And that's a joint hearing with capital investments and climate and energy. So I'm hoping to continue to engage and work directly with state agencies, leaders and staff, and of course our legislators.
Does the state of Minnesota pay for
Sorry, Karen, hold on one second. I think we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. It's Rory and then Bruce and then Rory, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, so I actually found out about this discussion because I think it was Rabbi Alexander posted about it in the MN350 email chain. So this kind of communication stuff is around climate change. It's kind of my bread and butter. I was wondering, you kind of mentioned this a little bit, but in terms of thinking about how to communicate about climate change, obviously it's not just an issue of trying to get people to think about and care about something that is kind of on such a large scale. It's also we're actively kind of fighting a disinformation campaign from, a lot of the fossil fuel companies who stand to lose if we take this seriously. So I guess my question is, do you think it is important to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how to communicate these issues, that there is that aspect of countering disinformation, or does just kind of talking about it with the sort of personal connections, person to person, rather than trying to rely on the statistics, does that kind of address that on its own, and we don't need to get, spread out too far into thinking about too many things?
Yeah, Rory, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I think, so there are lots of people who do thinking around this. There's all sorts of models for this, particularly around climate change and other controversial topics. And I think, it is helpful to brush up on your expertise, because one of the things that when we do in this idea of sort of mis or disinformation and debunking myths is understanding where some of the common myths come from and that the characteristics of that misinformation, because that can help us when we're engaging in conversation and these personal stories to identify where misinformation is maybe occurring or where someone's been given misinformation. I think one of the most effective debunking tools is actually letting people know how they've been misled. And so that might actually include a fact or a figure. But there's a great Skeptical Science is a wonderful blog. It includes a lot of information about climate myths and debunking myths. But the person who started that, John Cook, he's a researcher at George Mason University. He has developed a wonderful model about climate misinformation called FLICC, FLICC. There are some great videos of him online talking about it, but it basically outlines the common fallacies, misinformation, conspiracy theories. I'm trying to remember the acronym off the top of my head, but there's a debunking handbook that he's also created. And I think sort of brushing up on those and staying abreast of that information, as well as thinking about this idea of being able to help signal to people. People really don't like to be lied to. And if we can point out where they've been misinformed or misled in the service of an agenda, that's a great way to debunk myths and sort of replace those myths with facts. And so it is, of course, a balance, right? You can't go into a conversation without any evidence, but I don't think we always have to lead with the evidence. But it is, of course, helpful with this topic to be armed with being able to understand the sources of some of that misinformation or this misunderstanding around the topic.
So Bruce, let's make this the last question.
Okay, thank you. I don't ascribe to doom and gloom. And Margaret Mead once said, never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed is the only thing that has. When the people lead, the leaders will follow. Let's hope so. On a time scale, the 414 parts per million, that's carbon in the atmosphere?
Carbon dioxide,
yeah.
Yes.
And it's been said that we need to get it down to around 350 to sustain. What was a time period that we jumped, and was it only in the last 50, 60 years that we jumped to that 414 because of the combustion of fossil fuels? And how quickly do we need to get, and I don't, again, ascribe to doom and gloom, do we need to get that number down to where it would be sustainable, which they say is around 350 parts per million of carbon?
Yeah, so good question. So yeah, it's been since around the late 1950s that we've really sort of increased the concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere. Of course, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution marks our significant production of greenhouse gases, but of course, that all ramped up sort of around the 1950s, 1960s. And so, yes, we've been marching very rapidly towards, obviously an increase in CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. In terms of sort of bending that curve, what I can tell you is that in terms of thinking about emissions in the context of these global policy targets, which of course are not the same as getting us back to 350 degrees or 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but we have about a decade of current emissions left before we've basically overshoot that target. So that's the 7.6% reduction in total emissions, basically for us to reach those targets. So if we do nothing, we've got about 10 years left before we really have to bend the curve. And so the consequences of inaction, basically being able to make up for the 10 years of current emissions, it gets harder and harder and harder, and the changes have to be more and more dramatic. So if we can think about ways to transition our systems incrementally over time, right? The time we have to do that incremental change is getting narrower and narrower and narrower, as the scientific community is pointing out. But the sooner we act, the sort of less painful and less dramatic those changes have to be. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a special report in 2018 called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C. And they outline the consequences of, say, a 1.5 degree and a 2 degree world. And it's dramatic. Billions more people exposed to drought and heat wave every year if that 0.5 degree change. And so that 1.5 degree target is really critical for humans and the ecosystems that we rely on. And so, yeah, we've got to bend that curve, and now. And every day that passes is an opportunity lost. So yeah, but there's hope, and we see work happening, and we see individuals doing things. I mean, right, we started this by saying there's a lot that the state could be doing and should be doing. There's also a lot that individual staff within state agencies are doing, individual community groups are doing, groups like yourselves are doing, that for me give me a lot of hope and help me see that action is underway. And I think we just need to also start telling more of those stories of hope. And those are, unfortunately, are not the ones that capture the headlines. So I think we need to be better at promoting these stories of action and change. And hopefully it will become a bigger part of our narrative rather than the doom and gloom.
So I want to thank Dr. Roop for your information and your inspiration. And I hope that all of you will join me in taking up her charge to us, to having these conversations, especially now in this week of Tu B'Shvat, but of course far beyond, and invite anyone who would like to be involved in Bethel's social justice committee, in which climate change is one of our pillars, to be in touch with me and see how we can expand this conversation to more people in our community and beyond our community. So Darabha, thank you all so much. Hopefully we'll see you at other events this week. And thank you again to Dr. Roop.
Thank you all. I value your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very, very well done. Thank you, Rabbi Davis.
Thank you. And Rabbi.